Let's stick with politics. The Assembly of First Nations, it isn't waiting for the writ to drop to talk about its priorities in the election campaign. Today, Chief Perry Bellegarde announced what he wants to see from any newly elected federal leader. He joins me from Ottawa to talk about those priorities. And great to have you on the show, Chief. I always like to pick your brain about priorities. So put them in an order for me. 1, 2, 3. What do you do?
Well, I think the number one thing that we always talk about that affects not only people in Canada but throughout the world is climate change, climate destruction. So we've said that's number one, and we've got to move off our dependency on fossil fuels to clean energy, green energy, and there's a lot of economic development opportunities on that. So we said that's number one. We all need to look after Mother Earth, and I think all economic decisions have to be put on through an environmental lens. So we said that's number one, no question.
Let's stop there for a moment and talk about number one. How do First Nations, what role do First Nations play in mitigating climate change?
Well, again, in mitigating climate change, we want to start looking at the use of elders and traditional knowledge and developing policies and strategies going forward. We have a number of First Nations that are already doing great things, like Souk First Nation on solar, Chief Gord Planis. We've got Henvey Inlet on wind, Chief Makwabi up there, and as well microgrids in Northern Ontario. Chief King at Gull Bay. They're off diesel, and so there's things that can happen. So climate change, we've got to be involved in the development and design of any strategy going forward, no question. So we said that's number one.
Are you passing those ideas on to the three major parties?
All parties. We're using our document to influence their party platforms. We want to make sure, like we did in 2015, we had the Closing the Gap document. Now we have the Honoring Promises document. And all of the things that we put in that document are backed up by chiefs in Assembly resolution for direction, for immediate action upon. And we always said, these are not only First Nations issues, these are Canada's issues. And if you address them, you build a better country for everybody.
And I certainly wouldn't argue with you that climate change is right up there. Number two then, sir.
Well, we've said something that's been around for many years that has to be dealt with, and that's restorative justice. 30-40% of people going to jail are First Nations people, and we're 4% of the population. We've said there is no justice for First Nations people. They're only courts of law. And so we want to make sure that we look at overhauling the justice system that's there and start looking at new innovative ways, and as well respect for First Nations law. In Canada, you've got common law and civil law, but there's also First Nations law, natural law, creators law, and there's got to be space for that. And I think that's another thing going forward, because I think of Colton Bushy, I think of John Stiers. There's no justice for their families. And so we've got a lot of work to do there, even like policing as an essential service. For First Nations policing services.
Right. I'm just wondering, I realize you're on the program and I asked you here to talk about your priorities. I'm wondering how those priorities, your number two, would mesh with those of Canadians across the country, or whether theirs would be the economy and healthcare, and how you take restorative justice and say this must be on the platform.
Well, we're not saying no to everything else, like health and education and water and housing and infrastructure. All those things are important as well. We're saying something that really doesn't get talked about a lot should also become a focus and a strategy going forward. So we want to see some very strong positions coming forward from the Liberals and the Conservatives and the NDP and the Greens on these. But we can't forget about the investments in basic fundamental human rights like housing and water and education, and all those infrastructure needs have to be met. So that's in the document as well.
What's number three?
Just all the rights recognition, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We need to hear from all the parties that they will look at laws to implement the UN Declaration that's at least as strong as Bill C-262. And as well, having said that, we have a treaty relationship with the Crown. So treaty honoring and implementation is very key, and moving past the Indian Act and fixing those 4 outdated policies that are based on termination of rights, which is comp claims, specific claims, additions to reserve, the inherent right. They're all currently based on termination of rights and title, not recognition. So those are things that have to be front and center as well going forward.
Is there a party you feel most closely aligns to your priority list, your to-do list?
No, I've got to have a relationship with all parties, and I do. And that's the most important thing at the Assembly of First Nations. We have to get along with everybody, because on October 22, there could be a new Prime Minister. Who knows?
But can you get along with everybody? Sure, I want everybody to like me, on the air, but not everybody does. And I respect those and value those opinions as well. How do you say, I want everybody to have a relationship with us and work with us and like us?
Well, basically, we have to work with everybody that's there. And no matter who gets in on October 21, If you can deal with First Nations issues and priorities, you're building a better country because that gap starts to close. And there is a huge socio-economic gap that exists between Canadians and First Nations people. And if you can continue to make investments in education and training and housing, water, that gap starts to close. And therefore, the social costs are going to start coming down. In fact, $27 billion in GDP growth can happen to Canada's overall economy once First Nations people are educated and trained and working. So we've got to keep all that in mind. So it's an important election.
Absolutely. And final question for you. Important enough to vote? I'm looking at underrepresentation in voting. Although in 2011, 47% of registered voters on First Nations did go out and cast a ballot. And then in 2015, it totally jumped, sir, to 61% of registered voters living on reserves. I know you were one of those who said, you know, I never used to vote, and there were a whole bunch of reasons for that, and now you do. So how are you going to mobilize First Nations to cast a ballot in this election, which could be called any day now?
Well, embrace the concept of dual citizenship. You know, I voted. I'm a member of Little Black Bears First Nation, Little Black Bears Band. I'm Cree, speak Skidnahill, and Absisi. I speak some Cree. And because I vote, I'm also Canadian. So exercise that right to vote because we want to mobilize the vote and push that number past 61.5% of eligible voters because the message is simple. You want to be the Prime Minister, you want to be a member of Parliament, you better listen and focus on First Nations priorities because they're going to help you get elected. And as well, those priorities, if you focus on them, you're going to really be building a better country. And that's really what it's all about, working together.
I hope we get to talk again during the official campaign, but I thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Joanna.